All right, so here's what I want to say this morning. So I want to direct our attention to the first reading from 1 John. So I love that gospel. It reads like it sounds like a movie trailer. Like I can hear the movie trailer guy's voice narrating that gospel. It's exquisite. You should return to it for prayer later today. But I want to look at this reading we have from 1 John. John, who wrote the prologue to the Gospel of John, of course, who wrote the book of Revelation. John, who in the prologue of his gospel, he says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him. Without him, nothing came to be. He was in the beginning with God." And then he skips down and says, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Last week, on the feast of St. John the Evangelist, I said that his gospel is very much the gospel of the flesh. There's an emphasis on the flesh that you see in John's gospel that's just highlighted in a distinct way. You got Jesus' bread of life discourse, "Unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you do not have life within you." All of those things are in John's gospel. And why would that be the case? Well, go back to one of the things that we heard in one of the Johannine epistles, where he says, "What was from the beginning? What we have seen with our own eyes, what we have touched with our own hands, what we have heard, what we have looked upon concerns the word of life." And that word became flesh. That I'm convinced that John, as he grew into his old age, because he's the apostle he's the one who didn't abandon Jesus at the cross. And so seemingly as a reward for that, John didn't suffer an early martyrdom like the other apostles. He got to live to this ripe old age. Granted, he was in exile on the island of Patmos, but as he aged, he must have just been filled with this continuous wonder at the fact that in this man who washed John's feet, this man who broke bread, this man who walked by his boat and called him to come forth as he was a fisherman, this man who had a particular tenor to his voice and a glint to his eye and a sound to his laugh, this man in his flesh bore the presence of God. Not just as a representative, but was the fullness of the deity, that in Jesus God had made his dwelling among us. He must have contemplated over and over again the mystery of the Word made flesh. He must have contemplated the mystery of the Word made flesh. Like, I'm certain John was stunned to discover the whole momentum of Christianity is not a flight from the world to pursue and discover God in some disincarnate spirit reality, but it's the direct opposite. That Christianity, what Jesus was revealing, is that God had come into the world, that God had come to invade the world. The movement of Christianity is heaven moving into earth. It's a heavenized earth. It's towards the body. It's the redemption of the body, is what we hear Paul saying. Like, all of this is why we hear what John says in this first reading. He's talking about the spirit of the Antichrist. He says, "This is how you can know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that acknowledges Jesus Christ come in the flesh belongs to God. And every spirit that does not acknowledge Jesus does not belong to God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, who, as you heard, is to come, but is in fact already in the world." He's talking about this Antichrist spirit, right? Christ is the Word made flesh. John's talking about the Antichrist, the anti-Word. It's the negation of the Word made flesh. It's the negation of the logic of Christianity. That's the Antichrist spirit. It's a negation of spirit and matter coming together, a negation of God becoming flesh. And there is certainly that spirit in the culture that we live in, this sort of, I would say it's a dualistic worldview that sees a stark split between body and soul, between matter and spirit, like a fleeing from the body, right? The body is something that can be overcome, manipulated, changed, transformed at will. That the real me is this immaterial spirit that inhabits my body. That's That's all around us today. That's the spirit of the Antichrist, the anti-word. And that same spirit is also present in the church in many ways too. This idea of spirit good, body bad. The spirit looks upon the body with so much suspicion. But Jesus did not come to condemn our bodies, but to redeem our bodies. John is saying in his letter today, John is saying anywhere where we discover this spirit that negates God's desire to touch the flesh, to redeem the flesh, to become flesh, any sentiment or thought that sees the body as bad and the spirit as good, any sentiment that sees the body as the source of all of our problems and it should be shunned or punished or any of those things, like that, he says, is the spirit of the enemy who hates Christ, who hates the incarnation. Like, just notice how we worship as Catholics. I'm sure I've said this before, but Catholic worship, it's the most sensual of all religions. We stand, we sit, we kneel, we touch, we taste, we smell, we process, we listen. All of our senses are bombarded in worship as Catholics. Why? Because the body matters. Because matter matters. Because God became flesh and dwelt among us. Amen.